You know, as a student of history, I prep for this program not just by looking at the events that are going on today or went on yesterday, but digging a little deeper. I went and I dug into some quotes from Joseph Goebbels. And he was, as you know, the top propagandist for the National Socialists. And I looked at some of his quotes. And by the way, these quotes, when I read some of them, you'll see they are applicable whether it's communist regimes or fascist regimes, whatever the totalitarian state is. This one is famous. He said, if you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it. He said, the most brilliant propagandist technique will yield no success unless one fundamental principle is borne in mind constantly. It must confine itself to a few points and repeat them over and over. He said, think of the press as a great keyboard on which the government can play. Intellectual activity is a danger to the building of character. This was a very sick man, and yet he lays out exactly how the totalitarian regimes operate, whether it's in Red China today, whether it was in the Soviet Union before, whether it was the National Socialists in Germany, the fascists in Italy, or people who just lurch toward this notion of despotism, centralized despotism. Now, obviously, I would never accuse anybody on the scene today of practicing such a thing. Would you? Those quotes I read you have no application to today, do they? Anyway, so I heard David Axelrod today. ABC News is slavishly repeating his allegation and giving it as much news attention as it possibly can. I mean, what's David Axelrod? He's a hatchet man. He's the biggest surrogate Obama has, even bigger than Biden, but he's a hatchet man. And it's his job as a PR guy to come up with, well, the big lie. And the media in this country repeat it over and over and over again. Gee willikers. And today's big lie from David Axelrod, being played over and over and over again by ABC News, whether it's on TV or radio, is this. Cut 5, go.
This is the most secretive candidate that we've seen, frankly, since Richard Nixon. Won't release his tax returns, won't reveal his bundlers, left Massachusetts with the hard drives from his computer.
Won't release his tax returns. He's releasing the tax returns he's required to release. That's how they know to attack him for this account or that account. He won't reveal his bundlers. He reveals the same information under federal law that the Obama campaign releases. But in the case of the Obama campaign, last time around, they wouldn't release the name of their foreign investors. Left Massachusetts with the hard drives from his computer? How about that? Would this be the same administration that refuses to turn over documents on Fast and Furious, which resulted in one law enforcement officer being shot in the back with one of our own weapons, and a couple hundred Mexicans being murdered by drug cartel hoodlums in Mexico? Would this be the same administration now complaining about the hard drives? So I decided, who is this Axelrod? He talks more for Obama than Obama talks for Obama. Obama's busy taking a tour now of Ohio and Pennsylvania, a bus tour, talking about the outsourcing of jobs on buses that were made in Canada. And the irony's obviously lost on the media because they're busy regurgitating David Axelrod's propaganda. Repeat the big lie. Just repeat it over and over. Keep it simple. Just keep repeating it. Oops. Am I allowed to draw that point? So I got to digging, who is this Axelrod? And I found on a great website, a friend of mine, theothermccain.com, which links to a piece in the American Spectator by a professor from Grove City, a presidential scholar. Who is Axelrod? Well, in this piece, this rather extensive piece by the presidential scholar, the professor from Grove City, Paul Kengor, he dug up some fascinating facts, as Stacey McCain writes, about the background of Axelrod, showing Obama's top political strategist, ready for this? To have deep ties to the American Communist Party and other leftist individuals and organizations. Oh, I know there's a lot of people out there, oh, Mark, please don't go there. Don't go where? Don't go where? For example, Axelrod's mother, Myrtle Bennett Axelrod, worked for the left-wing New York newspaper PM. Although it lasted less than a decade, 1940 to 48, PM became notorious because of its penetration by Stalinists and others who promoted the Communist Party line on issues both foreign and domestic. Professor Ken Gore points out that PM's famed Washington correspondent, I.F. Stone, was subsequently identified as a Soviet agent, both in the so-called Venona documents and also by a former top KGB official, Oleg Kuligin. It's unclear whether Axelrod's mother fit in the orbit of the communists, Soviet sympathizers, and other so-called progressives who worked at PM, Ken Gore says, because despite scouring reel upon reel of microfiche, copies of the newspaper, he was unable to find a single article with her byline. Gee, maybe she took the equivalent of the computer drives out of the system, huh? Nevertheless, her association with the paper locates her politics on the far left fringe of the American political spectrum in the 1940s, which would seem important to understanding her son's later activities. While a student at the University of Chicago in the early 70s, David Axelrod began working as a political reporter for the Hyde Park Herald, which Professor Ken Gore says brought Axelrod to the attention of Don Ross and David Cantor. Both of these men were associated with the Communist Party and other far-left groups. Mark, what's this McCarthyism stuff? It's not McCarthyism. We call these facts. Ken Gore explains that David Cantor's father, Harry Cantor, was an instructor at the Abraham Lincoln School, an infamous Chicago-based CPUSA front that instructed pupils in the teachings of Marx and Lenin. And Cantor followed in his communist father's footsteps, so that a 1970 congressional investigation report, quote, Guide to Subversive Organizations and Publications, today that would include, I guess, the Tea Party, lists Dave Cantor 25 times. His Chicago-based publishing company was believed to be partly subsidized by Soviet funds in the 60s. Professor Ken Gore writes, David Cantor and Don Rose joined forces to start a Chicago-area community newspaper called Hyde Park Kenwood Voices. Stick with me. You won't get this anywhere else. And it ought to be all over the place. This Cantor-Rose publication was on the far left, Professor Ken Gore writes. Hyde Park Kenwood Voices editorialized for the abolition of the House Committee on Un-American Activities, whose investigations had exposed the pro-Soviet subversive activities of both David Cantor and his father, Harry. At a time when U.S. troops were fighting communism in Vietnam, Hyde Park Kenwood Voices also published, quote, pro-Hanoi screeds by Students for a Democratic Society members based in Chicago, Professor Ken Gore writes. Oh, I know, we're supposed to take all this stuff off the table. Only Romney's personal life is on the table. I get it, but I don't deal with their talking points. I plow ahead. Don Ross was associated with the SDS, the left-wing campus organization, from which Bill Ayers' terrorist splinter group, Weather Underground, spun off in 1969. See the nice little circle that's formed with these people? And was also a member of the National Mobilization Committee to end the war in Vietnam, commonly known by the slang term the MOB. Rose and Cantor played a critical role as mentors to young David Axelrod, Ken Gore explains, citing numerous sources, including David Cantor's son, Mark Cantor, for the fact that it was a letter of recommendation from Don Ross that helped Axelrod land a job as a reporter for the Chicago Tribune. By 1987, all three of these men, Don Rose, David Cantor, and David Axelrod, who had left journalism to become a paid political advisor, were part of the campaign to re-elect Harold Washington as Chicago's mayor. Professor Ken Gore's American Spectator article is important because Axelrod's background, like Obama's associations with left-wing figures such as Frank Marshall Davis and Bill Ayers, shows how ideas, policies, and rhetoric originating in the Marxist-Leninist doctrine and anti-American propaganda have been mainstreamed in the Democrat Party. Critics of Professor Ken Gore's investigation will likely raise the charge of McCarthyism, expecting us to miss the irony of that accusation because, of course, revelations from the Venona papers after the Soviet Union fell, thousands and thousands of documents were able to be reviewed, and other sources have largely vindicated McCarthy. There were Soviet agents in the U.S. government, and the American Communist Party was at all times an instrument of Soviet subversion. I will link and have linked to the American Spectator full piece by Professor Ken Gore on my social sites. It was printed in March in the American Spectator. Now, I'm not done with this David Axelrod, because you can see his techniques on television. This is a very evil man, a very diabolical man. He says what he means, and he means what he says, even though he knows that they're flat-out lies intended to smear people, intended to destroy people. So, I think it's important that Obama's number one hatchet man, his number one surrogate, be exposed. Folks, you have to understand the nature of these folks. Many of you refuse to think back to these times. Many of you are shocked. Never heard of it before. Axelrod is a hard radical leftist like Van Jones, and that's why Obama likes him. At the center of this wheel is Obama. Bill Ayers and Bernadette Dorn. Weather Underground. What was the Weather Underground? The Weather Underground was a communist terrorist organization. They used violence. They blew up buildings. They killed people. It even stuns me today. Well, we can't talk about that. Take it off the table. Nothing personal. Nothing personal? Personal would be if I come on the air and talk about, say, Obama's ears. I'm not talking about Obama's ears. I'm talking about his character and his belief system. And Axelrod, a hatchet man. But keep all this in mind. Axelrod, Ayers, Dorn. Remember Rashid Khalidi? My dear friend Andy McCarthy, expert on this stuff. He did a piece a couple of years ago in National Review. Rashid Khalidi is a former PLO mouthpiece, as he wrote. He has signed an appeal for funds to outfit another ship, he wrote back in 2010, McCarthy, that like the peace flotilla would try to break Israel's blockade of Gaza. The Los Angeles Times has had in its possession, you remember this? But has suppressed for all these years from the public a videotape of Khalidi's 2003 going-away bash when he left the University of Chicago to become the Edward Said Professor of Arabic Studies at Columbia.